Well, by anybody's estimation, 2020 has been one of those years. And now we are in the final few weeks of it. And we're going to have a conversation about what we've learned from 2020. My name's Dan. I'm one of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship in Cornelius, North Carolina. I'm with Pastor Ben, who's the other teaching pastor. And Ben, 2020 was the year that was it not?
I mean, if we sat here a year ago, none of us, just thinking back to where we were 12 months ago, could have ever predicted that 2020 was going to be like this. Even if we would have said, hey, there's a pandemic going to come, I think in our minds we would have said, oh, okay, we have an idea of what it would look like and how it would affect our lives. But no one could have, that with the election and the political issues and
the civil unrest with
George Floyd issue. I mean,
the rise of Black Lives Matter, the rise of the folks out in Portland and Seattle,
Antifa. It just feels like 2020 felt like I've never done drugs, but it felt like a giant acid trip. You know what I mean? Like you're just kind of like, what's happening next?
Yeah.
I think 2020 showed, to us that the world is fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
I think that there's so many things that we can learn from it. I mean, who would have thought that we wouldn't have had church for 10 weeks in a row? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like there's things that have happened that you look back and you think, how did we get through that? And God has given us a sense of perseverance that we go through and know that we can handle it. But I do think that it's good to always reflect. I mean, this is the time of year that we should reflect on things that we've learned, how we've grown. But we also anticipate with the new year coming up, fresh start, what do we look forward to, all those things. So I think we need to keep doing those. We need to keep, contemplating, God, what have you taught me this year? And I would encourage you, if you're listening to this, to spend some time writing that down. What are the things that you have learned? How have you grown? How do you know God better? What has He done for you that you've seen His faithfulness throughout the year? And then looking to the new year, what do we do in spite of, in light of all the things we've been through? How does that shape the way we move forward for 2021? So I think spending an episode reflecting on what we've learned is a really important thing to do.
Well, let's start off with that then. And, looking back on 20, by the way, if you're watching this on the webcast, I'm wearing a Grinch sweatshirt because
that's a 2020.
It's a 2020 Christmas, a very COVID Christmas, but, I mean, it won't be hard for us to find, I think, things that happen to us, but maybe it's almost, in some ways, it feels a little premature to say I've learned these things because I feel like I'm still learning things in the midst of this.
That's a good point.
But what would you say? And I kind of want to divide the conversation into two parts. What have we learned, and what are we going to change in 2021?
Mm-hmm.
And even to say what are we going to change in 2021 feels very presumptuous to me at this stage because we don't really know when the pandemic is going to be over. We don't know what the rate of vaccination is going to be. We don't know what we don't know, which makes it interesting. But we'll make some assumptions and try to look forward a little bit. But what are some things that you've learned in 2020?
Wow. For me, there's a couple things I think God's taught me. Number one is that you can find something good to praise God for in all things. I know that might sound cliche, but I just think about when COVID really hit and we didn't really know what it was. We didn't know how deadly it was. There was a lot of uncertainty. Everything shut down. I think about the first quarantine that hit right in the March, right middle of March through the end of April, or really the end of May, I should say, when that real first lockdown was happening. The blessing that I got out of that, I mean, as much as there was a lot of uncertainty, we just had the best time as a family hanging out together at night. Mm-hmm. And I just look back at that and to say, there was a lot of hardship. There were people were going through a lot of fear. There were people that were losing their lives during that time. There's a lot of uncertainty about what this virus was. But in light of all that, man, I got to spend more time with my kids. I got to spend more time getting to know them and their hearts. And so I think one of the things that God has been teaching me is to look for His goodness in things that I wouldn't normally do. It's easy for us to be like, oh, things are shut down and this is going bad and this is going bad, as opposed to looking for the good that God is, because God is a good God. The goodness of God is something that does not change. It doesn't change with circumstances. It doesn't change with I've heard someone say this one time. Whenever something good happens in your life, you're like, man, isn't God good?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, isn't God good when you lose your job still? Like,
Right.
There's things that we can still look to the goodness of God and say, no, God is a God of blessing. He's a God of presence. He's a God who's always looking to give good gifts to his children. So therefore, even in spite of uncertainty and in spite of challenges and all the things that have gone along with that, even through my own journey of going through COVID and going through a bout of sickness, there were good things that came out of that. There was a lot of good that came out of my experiences, good and bad. And so one of the biggest things God's taught me is look for the good. Look for the good that I am doing in spite of what seems to be falling apart around you. So that's been a big one for me. What about you? What's been something that you would say that you've learned this year?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's probably going to be a little grinchier sounding than yours.
That's why we work so well together, Dan.
Yeah. I'm the half-empty guy. For me, it is kind of two sides to one coin, or maybe two separate coins, but I have a fresh realization on how broken our culture is and how broken the American church is. So whether we're talking about, let me talk about the church first. This has been a rough year for the church. When we literally closed for 10 weeks, perhaps across most of the country, 95% of the churches. But there are very, very few churches who would honestly say they're stronger now than they were.
Right.
At least in terms of the basic measurements of church attendance, participation, volunteers, engagements, giving, all the different things that, we frequently look to indicate signs. I'm quite frustrated with the confusing lines that exist now between our civil liberties and freedom of worship and those kind of things and government authority. But I would also say the dysfunction within church leadership across the country is there's a lack of unity that I've rarely seen, particularly in evangelical churches. There are some people who truly believe that if you opened your church back up, that you were hating your neighbor. There were others who believed if you closed your church for the protection of your people, that you were literally capitulating to the government and endorsing, everything from socialism to atheism. And I think both those extremes are wrong.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated with the fact that frequently, and it's true of our church and it's true of everybody's church, but I'm frequently frustrated with the fact that there are people who you haven't heard from who were pretty regular at church last year, who you haven't heard from this year, and they've used COVID as that excuse, and yet they post pictures of themselves out on the lake or out to eat or on vacation at Disney World or so forth. And so does COVID only infect the church on Sunday mornings between 9 and 11, but it doesn't affect anywhere else. Yeah. And I have no problem with the person who has said, for the safety of my family and my compromised immune system, I'm going to stay home from church, but I'm also going to stay home from everything else. The problem I have are those who have used it as a convenient excuse to detach themselves from the body of Christ, both for the fact that they need it and for the fact that the body needs them.
Yes.
So I'm also frustrated with the lack of moral clarity that we're seeing even among senior leadership of churches across the country. This has been a dark year that, unless you follow it closely, I mean, whether we're talking about James McDonald or Ravi Zacharias or Carl Lentz, we've seen a lot of high-profile pastors and spiritual leaders who have been revealed to live double lives, lives that are, and no one expects pastors to be perfect.
Right.
We understand that, but a level of duplicity, a level of disappointment that I think is reflected in the congregations. Yeah. How can we expect the congregations to be healthier than the leadership? I've also just seen just kind of a rancor among Christian leadership that perturbs me. And then the other thing I would also say is the uber involvement of the evangelical church in politics. And I know this one's going to make a lot of people upset, but I still think that we need to have important conversations on who our allegiance and loyalty lies to. That doesn't mean we can't be good citizens, good Americans. It doesn't mean we can't have political opinions. But when we so thoroughly interweave our politics around a political party or political leadership so that the lines become muddled and grayed to the extent that they currently are, I think we've lost something about the distinctiveness that the church ought to be as it is in regard to the gospel.
Yeah.
I think we have basically said to 50% of the population, if I got to choose between politics and you going to hell, I'm going to vote Republican. And that really bothers me. And I know there are going to be some people that will send me emails and be really upset with me on that. I'm used to it, so go ahead, bring it on. And I'm about as a conservative a guy, and I love politics about as much as anybody you'll ever meet. But man, my lines are pretty clear. So those are just some things that I've learned, I think, about the church and our culture in general, just the rapid deterioration we have of a culture where we've accepted really what is deviancy.
I think one of the things, before we get into the culture a lot, what you said about the church, I think all of us within church leadership, pastoral leadership that have been leading for a number of decades, I think all of us would say there are signs, there are metrics of quote unquote church health that we've measured for a long time. Attendance, giving, budget, those kinds of things. But there's this inner feeling that maybe we're not as strong as we really are.
Absolutely.
We're not as healthy as we are. And I think that when this whole when the pandemic hit and all of the things that transpired in light of that, I think one of the things it showed was how, to me, it was going to draw a line to say who are the Christians who are truly committed to the local church, to the gospel of Jesus Christ, to the mission of the gospel, and how many were just kind of doing it out of social obligation or social benefit.
Yeah, custom.
And I think that's even the issue. So that's been one thing. The other issue has been how easy it was for one issue that has nothing to do with the gospel to divide the church so drastically. And I'm bringing up the issue of masks, and I don't want to belabor this, but you and I have been on the end of a lot of conversations and emails from people who, number one, feel very strongly like if we are going to promote wearing masks, we are, again, I'm out. Yeah, we are compromising. We are not holding a line in trusting God. And then there's people who are saying, if you don't tell people and guard at the door people who are wearing masks, you don't love your neighbor, you're not loving, and you're just like, and you have these people that on both ends and both extremes love God and love the church and love everything. And every pastor I talk to says, my church is split down the middle. Oh yeah. And I feel like I can't make anybody happy, and it's wearing us out. And I think that was, you sit back and you look at everything and you're like, man, if Satan was looking to divide the church, who knew that it would be about masks? Right? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like those are the things that you think back and you're like, what could have kept us stronger, committed to one another in a way that lovingly thinking about what is best and being gracious towards one another, as opposed to making these hard lines and being like, if you do this, you are my enemy. You know what I mean? It's almost like you're my enemy if you don't agree with me. And I think that's been one of the things that's been shocking to me, is that the gospel of Jesus Christ has not been strong in our lives that have kept us more bound together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I agree with that. And again, my conversations with friends in the ministry is parallel to what you've experienced. And it's hard to have a productive conversation when you're in the midst of a crisis. Sometimes you're just trying to keep the ship upright in the water. But I think at some point we ought to go back, and maybe this is part of what we do in 2021, is go back and look at how we responded to crisis. Yeah. What did we learn about ourselves? You can walk into a hotel room and turn on the light and see dirt or mess or whatever. If you really want to see how messy we are, or how messy a hotel room is, go in there, turn the light off, and turn on a black light. Well, yeah, and then you'll probably never stay in a hotel again as long as you live. Exactly. I think to some extent we've turned a black light on in the church. We're seeing things that aren't obvious, but because of the level of crisis, we're seeing things that are pretty ugly and pretty disturbing, and we ought not just turn the light off and close the door and pretend that we didn't see what we saw. Yeah, that's so. I think those are some things that church leadership in the future ought to consider.
Yeah. You also mentioned, talking about the social fabric, things that we used to think of that our country was unified. We could have these internal disagreements, but fundamentally we're all about the same thing. And then all of a sudden it's like there's division, right? Like I think this year has shown so much that division is present. And I think that's one of the things that for us as Christians, we can look at any human division. It says in Ephesians chapter 2 that the gospel, that what Jesus Christ does is he comes to break down the dividing wall of hostility between us. And he talks about that wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, but I think it's any people group. It's any whether it's religious or ethnic or racial or gender, whatever that wall is, right? That the gospel of Jesus Christ can tear down that wall of dividing hostility. And what's fascinating to me is to see the world try to come up with solutions to that wall of hostility that only throws more gasoline on the fire and not bring true reconciliation, true repentance, true genuine harmony within all different peoples, all different ethnicities, all different colors, all different, I think that to me has been one of the things that stood out to me the most is the world thinks they have the solution for the problems, but it's just proving that they don't.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, and we also want quick answers and easy answers. And the problems we're facing are far more complex than that. Let's take for example the problem with racial reconciliation, whether we're talking about in the church or in the country. Right after the horrific incident in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and all that came out of that, there was a recognition, I think pretty universally, that this was wrong. This was a problem. And so it needed a reaction. It needed a response. And initially, we said we've got to do better than this. We've got to have these hard conversations and so forth. Then the Black Lives Matter became a movement as opposed to just simply a statement of, yeah, Black lives do matter, and perhaps we're not showing that with some choices. But then it became a philosophy. It became something bigger, and then it began embracing values that were antithesis to a biblical worldview. And so then it became an issue where, well, no, either Black Lives Matter or they don't. You've got to say it or you don't. You're racist. And all of a sudden the conversation completely broke down. And so, in other words, you had to embrace everything that the Black Lives Matter movement came to represent, which also included things like intersectionalism and critical race theory, and basically the dissolution of the nuclear family, all those things. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa. I just love my Black friends and neighbors, and I want to do better. And then all of a sudden we've become part of something that you say, oh no, I'm backing out of this. And so then the problem remains unaddressed because we've retreated back to the same corners we had before, and nothing's changed. So, for the first 30, 60 days, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of effort, a lot of dialogue that was taking place. And then all of a sudden it became a war. And, everything from burning cities down to making public declarations on social media. And all of a sudden, and the easy thing to do is to find your extreme position, retreat to it, and attack anybody who doesn't agree with you. The difficult thing is to listen. The difficult thing is to say, okay, this is a legitimate point. Now, will you listen to a legitimate point I have? And to be able to dialogue in these ways. And until we get to that point, whether we're talking about theology or philosophy or social fabric issues, social justice issues, we're going to continue this bomb lobbing that's going on that ultimately comes down to brute strength, threats of violence, activities that probably are well beyond the pale.
Yeah. One of the things I'm grateful for is, even in spite of all that, we have a blank slate ahead of us in 2021. And I know we're not going to have time to get into it. That'll be our next episode. But I do think that it's important for us to understand that everything that we're seeing, everything we're going through, it doesn't surprise God. God's not up in heaven being like, oh no, 2020 was not anticipated. As much as we are, kind of like, what had just happened? God up in heaven, who is sovereign, who is king. I mean, it's so good to read. I've been reading and praying through Psalm 139 recently. And there's a passage in there, I think it's verse 12, if I'm not mistaken. But it's talking about the omnipresence of God. And one of the things that he said was, even in the darkness, darkness is light to you. I love that picture. I love that poetic imagery, because what the psalmist is saying is, when everything is dark around me, when everything is dark in me, it's not dark to you. That there's a light, that there is a presence, that there is a meaning, that there is a foundation, that there is a hope that does not stop, that doesn't wane or fade, no matter what I'm going through. So I think that's a wonderful reminder for us that there is, where things seem to be dark, there's light with God, and there's solution, there's hope. And I think that's what, even in spite of all the things we talked about, things that we've learned, things that we are disappointed in this year. You just said, man, these are some hard things. We don't want to paint a rosy picture like 2020 was great. It was hard for a lot of people and a lot of churches and a lot of families, but at the same time, we can have that hope that sustains us. Yeah. And so I think that's good to remind us of as we finish off this episode.
Absolutely. And next episode, we're going to be talking about, well, what can we do differently in 2021 using the lessons that we have uncovered from 2020? And we hope you'll consider that as well. What are some things that you need to do? And by the way, what does re-engagement with your local church look like for you? What changes are you going to make? And what things are you going to require of you yourself in order to re-engage once the pandemic is over? This has been another episode of Life Talks. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.